This is Project 3 in Sprint 3 named Around the US. This page doesn't have any actual function right now, but pretty much every element on the page is part of a flexbox or grid type layout. These techniques ensure that the blocks and elements follow a predictable and manageable positioning and sizing that can be logically maintained. One of the main features of this project is the CSS grid layout that I have here, which it didn't necessarily have to be a grid, but I chose to do a grid because you can get a table-like layout like this by default. So grid uses columns and rows by default, unlike Flexbox, which you have to use flex wrap and adjust padding accordingly to ensure that it looks good. But CSS Grid does all this by default. And you can also adjust the height and width of the columns and rows accordingly, and it affects all the elements. You could also do it for individual elements, but the nice thing is you affect all elements using the main grid class. Like you see here, pretty much elements list. You can apply that to elements list and it affects all the elements. You can also adjust the row and column gaps, which is the purple area here, without having to manipulate the elements themselves or adding margins or paddings, and then having to use a pseudo class to remove or alter those stylings for the nth element um, if you were using Flexbox, which is one of the nice things about CSS Grid, and it simplifies the whole process. The main feature of this project is responsiveness. So it was designed to be 1280 at maximum for desktops, and in my design I have it where the upper bound is 775 pixels for tablets and 637 for mobile devices. So you have, if I reset it to 1280, I could just drag it, and if you notice nothing breaks, everything scales accordingly, none of the icons are on top of each other, and if you go down all the way to 320, you see this is pretty much what was in the Figma design. And there is no horizontal scroll bar. Everything is sized accordingly, according to spec. All right. So profile.css is a good place to demonstrate how all these things were coded. So for the tablet view, we have margin left 18px to the add button here. Right? That is pretty much the only change that I implemented, because without it, the add and edit buttons would be squished right up against each other. So this ensures that it looks pretty good until you go to the column layout with the profile. And with the mobile layout, a lot of the stylings were different, like the font sizes and centering and all that were a little bit different, so all of that was adjusted here. In the index.html file, semantic tags were used, which ensures that search engines can find content more effectively, right? It can get relevant context from the web page. So like, okay, what is the header, right? So depending on what's in the header, it will provide search results accordingly. And it aids in accessibility. So like for screen readers or text to speech, all these things depend on semantic tags to work effectively. And so that's why they were used, and that's the purpose of semantic tags. This project was also designed according to the BEM, or Block Element Modifier methodology, which ensures that everything is organized. So you have all these blocks in this block folder right here, and they are ordered in the index.css according to the order in which they appear in index.html. Right? A block is any logical and functional page component that can be used anywhere on the page and anywhere else. So if I were to move the header block, well, that's a poor example. If I were to move the profile block to the bottom of the page, to the bottom of all the blocks, it will not break the layout. It will just look weird where this entire profile section appears at the bottom, but it will not break the layout, and that's the nice thing about blocks. And every block contains pretty much an element, right? An element is a component of a block that cannot be used outside of their parent block. Modifiers are special classes that you can assign to elements and modifiers, which allow you to modify that specific element without having to use certain pseudo classes to do so, which further simplifies the code and allows you to apply that same class to different elements that you want to style accordingly as you add elements or as you add features to your page. So, like I highlighted before, every single block is separated into different CSS files for ease of maintenance and readability. And in every single file, the class names are organized according to the order in which they appear in the index.html file, which further improves readability and ensures that styles are applied accordingly, so you don't have styles overriding other styles that you don't want being overridden, right? And in index.css, like I said before, same thing. They are ordered according to the order in which they appear in index.css, in index.html, and they all come after normalize and fonts. So normalize acts as a reset for a lot of different styles and a lot of different things regarding CSS that allows you to have a baseline that is always known regardless of what browser you are using. And fonts comes first before all of your blocks to ensure that the fonts are loaded in before your blocks, right? For the fonts specifically, they were added to their own file, right, in the vendor folder and in the fonts folder with the fonts that are connected, and then that CSS file was linked to the HTML file through index.css to allow for simplicity. So that way I don't need two link style sheet declarations. The main challenges that I faced in this project were just learning how to use Figma and learning where to find the information that I needed, like font size and so, because there are certain things that the web version of Figma has that the desktop version kind of lacks. And so depending on what you're used to, that will kind of affect how easily this project went for you. And certain things I found was easier to find on web, on desktop. And so the learning curve is a little bit shallow, but as I went along, it got a lot easier. And I learned. Now, if you ask me to find something, I know where to find it. The media queries were especially challenging because initially I wasn't using this, the responsive layout in DevTools in Chrome, to determine, okay, this is the point where things start to break, and that's probably a good breakpoint, right? I was just going strictly according to the brief, which is not necessarily the best thing to do, right? Yeah, so that pretty much wraps up a good overview of this project.